What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed? Edward Hawthorne's voice shattered the stillness like a hammer against glass. He stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, his tall frame rigid with rage, disbelief carved into every hard line of his face. Rainwater dripped from his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. All his attention was locked on the woman in his bed, Maya Williams. She shot up from the mattress, heart pounding, eyes wide, not with guilt, but with shock. The twin boys, Ethan and Eli, lay curled on either side of her, finally asleep, their faces soft, breathing deep. The teddy bear in Ethan's arms rose and fell in rhythm with his chest. "I can explain," Maya said quietly, trying not to wake the boys. Her hands lifted slightly, calm, open. They were scared. Eli started crying. Ethan got a nosebleed. Edward didn't let her finish. His palm came down fast, a sharp crack echoing off the walls as it struck her cheek. Maya staggered back, gasping, one hand flying to her face. She didn't cry out. Didn't even speak. Her eyes just locked on his, stunned more by the blow than the fury. "I don't care what excuse you have," Edward growled. "You're fired. Get out of my house now." She stood still for a moment, hand pressed to her cheek, trying to steady her breath. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper. "They begged me not to leave them. I stayed because they were finally calm. Finally safe. I said, get out." Maya glanced down at the boys, still sleeping so deeply, so peacefully, as if the shadows that haunted them had finally lifted. She leaned over gently, kissed the top of Eli's head, then Ethan's. No words, no fanfare. And then she stepped away from the bed, shoes in hand, and walked past Edward without another word. He didn't stop her. He didn't apologize. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller turned as Maya descended the stairs. The red mark on her cheek spoke volumes. The older woman's eyes widened in shock. Maya said nothing. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Maya stepped into the gray afternoon, pulled her coat tighter, and began walking toward the gate. Back upstairs, Edward stood in the master bedroom, still breathing hard. He looked at the bed again, jaw tight, and then something registered. The quiet. He moved closer. Ethan's brow was smooth. No tossing, no whispering, no cold sweat. Eli's thumb was in his mouth, but his other hand was resting on the blanket, still relaxed. They were asleep. Not drugged. Not exhausted by crying. Just asleep. His throat tightened. 14 nannies, therapists, doctors. Hours of screaming, fits, and anxiety. And yet, Maya, this soft-spoken stranger, had managed what none of them had, and he'd struck her. He sat down on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. Shame bled into his chest like ink in water. On the nightstand, a note lay folded once. He opened it. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." It wasn't signed. He read it twice, then again. His reflection in the nearby mirror looked back at him. A man hardened by grief, drowning in control, choking on silence. Down the hall, Mrs. Keller stood watching. "Sir," she said softly. "She didn't touch a thing in here. Only brought them in when the little one had a nosebleed." He didn't respond. "She stayed because they asked. That's all. They didn't ask for me. They didn't ask for anyone else. Just her." Edward looked up slowly, eyes dark with something more than anger now. Something closer to regret. Outside, the gate creaked closed. And for the first time in months, the Hawthorne house was silent. Not with grief or rage, but something else. Peace, the kind Maya had left behind. The house was too quiet, not the comforting kind, like the hush of snowfall or the soft turning of pages in an old book. This was the kind that felt wrong, hollow and unfinished, like a question left unanswered. Edward Hawthorne sat alone in his study, glass of scotch untouched beside him. The note Maya had left resting on the desk like a judgment. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." He'd read it 7 times. Outside, dusk spread over the estate like a heavy quilt, and the wind pressed softly against the windows. Inside, the twins still slept, oblivious to the storm they'd just slept through, oblivious to the fact that the one person they'd allowed into their fragile world was gone. Edward leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his temples. His hand stung faintly. The ghost of the slap he delivered still etched into his skin. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't who he believed he was. And yet it had happened. A moment of misjudged fury born from grief and 1,000 quiet failures. He had hit a woman. And not just any woman. He stood suddenly and made his way upstairs. The hallway outside the boys' bedroom smelled faintly of lavender and warm cotton. A small wooden stool sat against the wall. Maya's sketchbook was on top, closed neatly, as if she'd left it there on purpose. He picked it up. Inside were simple drawings, rough, untrained, but full of heart. 2 boys holding hands beneath a tree, a tall house with too many windows, a figure sitting between the boys, arms stretched out like wings, a short caption beneath. The one who stays. He exhaled slowly. In the nursery, Eli stirred. Edward peeked inside. The boy rolled over but didn't wake. No nightmares, no tears. He closed the door softly. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller was folding napkins when Edward entered the kitchen. She looked up and froze. Something in his expression told her to put the linen aside. "She's gone," he said simply. "I know," she replied. "I made a mistake," he said almost to himself. Mrs. Keller raised her eyebrows, but her voice stayed neutral. "You don't say." "She was in my bed." "She was in your room," Keller corrected. "Because the boys wouldn't sleep anywhere else." "You weren't here." "I was. I heard them cry. Beg for her. She calmed them." He pressed his lips together. I know what you thought," she said gently. "But you weren't thinking." Silence stretched between them. He looked at the chair where Maya had sat during lunch only yesterday. It felt like weeks ago. "I need to find her," he said. Mrs. Keller didn't argue. "Start with the return address on her letter." "Georgia." He nodded, already heading toward the hall. Across town, Maya sat alone on a bench outside the train station. Her cheeks still throbbed beneath the cold. She hadn't cried. Not when he yelled, not when he hit her. Not even when she walked past the front gates with nothing but her bag and the ache of unfinished work in her chest. But now, with her coat wrapped tight and her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, tears finally welled. She wiped them quickly. Not because she was ashamed, but because crying in public was a habit she'd spent years unlearning. A woman nearby watched her for a moment, then offered a tissue without a word. Maya smiled in thanks and looked up at the night sky. It was funny, in a cruel way. She had survived worse than a slap. She'd endured being abandoned by a foster family at age 11, losing her own son to illness, being told over and over that she was too soft to handle hard cases. But that house, those boys, they had reached something inside her she hadn't touched in years. What do you think of Maya? If you believe she's someone truly special, give her a like to show your support. And don't forget to share where you're watching this video from. BUP Stories. Who knows? Someone right near you might be watching it, too. The train pulled in with a long sigh of brakes and metal. She stood slowly, not sure if she'd board. Her ticket was in her coat pocket. Destination, Savannah. But her heart was still upstairs in a White House in Greenwich, where 2 boys were finally learning to sleep. She sat back down. The next morning, Edward stood in his son's room with a tray of breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast with strawberry jam, a small bowl of cut fruit. He hadn't done this before. Not once since their mother died. Eli sat up, groggy. "Where's Miss Maya?" Edward hesitated. Ethan sat up, too. "Is she gone?" Edward nodded. "She had to leave." "Why?" Eli's voice cracked. "She didn't do anything bad," Ethan said, eyes narrowing. "She helped us. You saw we were good." Edward knelt beside the bed, placing the tray on the nightstand. "It wasn't your fault, marry me?" She looked up, stunned, not because of what it was, but because he said it now, softly, in a way that wasn't a proposal. It was a promise. She didn't answer at first. She closed her sketchbook and pressed it to her chest. Then she said, "Yes, but only if you know I'm not perfect." He brushed her hair out of her face. "Neither am I, but we're better at growing together." And outside, the wind rustled through the oak tree as if congratulating them with ancient approval, because healing had become inheritance. Family built not by blood, but by 1,000 everyday actions wrapped in gold. And in that moment, Maya Williams felt rooted in flying all at once. Spring had fully arrived. By the time the Hawthorne-Williams Center opened its second location in Bridgeport, the unveiling ceremony was quiet, purposeful. Children from the center in Greenwich stood beside Maya and Edward, holding signs they'd painted. "Hope grows here. Second chances live." 2 neighbors lined the sidewalk. Cameras flashed gently and bees hummed among newly planted daisies in recycled tins. Maya stood before the small crowd, sunlight catching the gold flecks in her hair. She could feel centuries of expectations. The expectation that she would fail, the expectation that her past might define her future, but here she was, surrounded by people who had witnessed her fight for belonging and won. Edward stood beside her, his arm around her waist. He gave a nod when she began. "We launched this center because we believed in the power of staying. But today, we're here to say that healing deserves wings, too. Not just permanence, but possibility." Children outside cheered and waved. Media crews filmed from the street, but Edward kept his gaze on the families waiting behind them. People who showed up because they wanted to see something real. Later, after greeting dignitaries and fielding questions from curious press, Maya wandered behind the building where volunteers were hanging fresh banners and organizing craft stations. Lorraine approached with a tray of lemon squares and bottled water. She handed Maya one and smiled without intrusion. "They're good," Mia said through a mouthful. Lorraine laughed softly. "Homemade, like this place?" Mia paused, then asked, "Do you want to walk the gardens?" They strolled down a path lined with budding roses and tiny saplings. Lorraine paused before a sapling planted in honor of Ethan and Eli. Its leaves fluttered in a breeze that smelled like pollen and possibility. "I planted this," Maya said, "so someone who feels alone knows they can root even through hard soil." Lorraine placed her hand on the tiny branch. "You have deep roots." That afternoon, inside the community room, staff were gathering for the first training session at the new site. Angela stood at the front, welcoming them with warmth. Belle sat nearby, sketching program plans while Joseph organized supplies. Locals filled tables, curious and hopeful. Edward slipped in quietly and whispered to Maya, "You've changed thousands of lives." She smiled at him. "We're just getting started." Later, Maya and Belle walked through the unfinished wing where future therapy rooms arched beneath skylights. Belle paused at a window overlooking the road. "There's so many roads out there," she said softly. "I used to think none of them led home." Maya followed her gaze. "Home is more than walls. It's what people build together." Belle nodded. "Then I'm building it." That evening, Edward hosted a modest dinner for the center team, including children, under strings of twinkling lights in the main courtyard. Plates of roasted vegetables, herb-roasted chicken, rice pilaf, and a big bowl of sliced strawberries filled the table. Ethan offered a polite thank you before passing the bread basket. Eli showed a volunteer how to fold napkins into airplane shapes. Belle carried a sketch pad, but joined in storytelling at the end, making everyone laugh with a dramatic retelling of a school science fail. Edward raised his glass of lemonade to staying, to building, to making roots deeper than fear. Maya lifted her glass into wings wide enough to let others fly. They clinked glasses, sealed by effort, empathy, and mutual trust. When most guests filtered away, Edward took Maya's hand and led her outside to the garden beds. Fireflies were just beginning to rise. He knelt, dug a fingertip into the soil, and picked a thin root of a rose. He planted it alongside the sapling already there, 2 stems intertwined at the base. "This is our promise," he said softly. Maya knelt beside him to keep tending. He nodded. Every week, even when it's hard. Maya smiled, tears glossy in her eyes. Every week, Ethan and Eli came out with a flashlight. They followed quietly, stood beside them, shining the light on the new route. "Mom," Ethan whispered. "That's so cool." Edward looked at them, then at Maya. "Thank you," he said, not loudly, but clearly. That night, back in the guest room, Mia paused at the doorframe outside the twins' bedroom. She watched as Edward tucked Eli in. She saw him gently smooth Ethan's hair before turning off the light. She stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall. Edward appeared beside her. "You staying?" She looked into the darkened doorway. "I'm always staying." He nodded. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Light filtered through the tinted glass, the faint glow from a lamp in the nursery. The last whispers of dusk through curtains. Outside, the new rose root rested in the soil, and above it, the sapling waited, rooted, growing together. It began with a letter, typed anonymous, postmarked from a small town in upstate New York. It arrived in a plain white envelope addressed to Edward Hawthorne in black ink. No return address, no signature, just 5 chilling words printed neatly across the center of the page. "She's not who you think." Edward read it twice before folding it neatly and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He said nothing to Mia that night or the next, but something in his demeanor shifted just enough that Maya, with her own sense of tension, felt the ripple beneath the calm. It wasn't the first time shadows had followed them, but this felt deliberate, more targeted. The next morning, while Maya supervised the younger kids in the art room, Edward sat alone in his office, staring at his laptop screen. A name echoed in his mind. Terrence Moraro, a former business partner, the kind of man who had always envied Edward's success and more dangerously resented his turn toward charity. He'd sent veiled threats before, mostly empty. But this had venom. Edward opened a secure browser and began digging. Within minutes, he'd found a blog post on an obscure forum. It wasn't explicitly about Maya, but it danced close. Words like fabricated backstory and sympathy branding caught his eye. He clicked out of the site, but the damage was done. He looked out the window. Maya was walking through the garden with Belle, her hand lightly on the young woman's shoulder. They laughed about something. Unaware, he clenched his fist. "That night over dinner," he asked, "did you ever go by another name?" Maya blinked. "What?" "Before Maya Williams. Legally or otherwise." She set her fork down. "Why are you asking me that?" He hesitated. "I got a letter. It suggested you might not be fully forthcoming." Maya stood up slowly. "Do you believe it?" Edward looked up. His face held conflict, not certainty. "I believe you. I do. But I had to ask." Her voice was quiet but steady. "I was Maya Simmons until I turned 18. Then I took my grandmother's surname, Williams, because my mother was gone and my father didn't earn the right to name me." Edward nodded, shame crawling up his spine. "I'm sorry." "I'm not ashamed of who I was," Maya continued. "But I am angry that someone thinks they can weaponize my past." Later, she found Belle in the old art room. She handed her a copy of the letter. Belle read it. "Someone scared." "Of what?" Maya asked. "Of what we've built." The next day, a news story aired, local, short. A talking head speculating about background checks and donor scrutiny. They flashed Maya's face on the screen. Words like mysterious rise and guardian of troubled youth. Maya turned off the television. She didn't flinch, but she didn't sleep that night either. Edward reached for her hand in bed. "I'll call the lawyers. We'll handle it." She nodded. "We always knew this could happen, but it's not fair." "No," he said, "but it's familiar." 3 days later, Maya stood before the full staff. Cameras had been barred. This was family. "I won't spend energy justifying my worth," she said. "But I will protect this space. If they come for me, let them. But they don't get to tear down what we've built." Angela stood.